Okay. Well, yeah, please. The fifth edition of the Seapower for Africa Symposium is here. All rise for the welcoming of the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, Honorable Angelina Motshekga. Please be seated. Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, Honorable Angelina Motshekga, Foreign Delegation Chiefs of Defense Forces of Eswatini, General Mashikilisana Moses Fakutse, and from Zimbabwe, General P.V. Sibanda, Chief of Navies and their representatives with delegations in attendance of the 5th edition of the Seapower for Africa Symposium. Representatives from the SA Army, Major General McCure, members of the Military Attaché and Advisory Corps, members of the Plenary Defense Council, generals and admirals, officer commanding of ships and shore units, senior officers, junior officers, Master-at-Arms of the South African Navy, Master Warrant Officer Molefe, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Botani, and welcome to the Seapower for Africa Symposium 2024, hosted here at Cape Town International Convention Center by the Chief of the South African Navy, Vice Admiral Mondelo Bese. As we prepare to begin the day's proceedings, we shall take note of the following sequence, especially for the morning session that will end at 11 o'clock. The Chief of the South African Navy will do the welcome speech and on completion introduce and invite the Minister of Defense Force for the keynote address. Thereafter, we will commence with an official photo session where members of the media will have the opportunity to take official photographs of delegates. We will then proceed back into Hall 5 for a media question and answer session. Members of the media are encouraged to approach the media liaison officers, Commander Grootboom and Commander Medupe, and submit questions prior so as to make most efficient use of the allocated time. I am Rear Admiral Bubele Mhlana, who will facilitate the morning session. I am a surface warfare officer, completed principal warfare officer course in HMS Dryad in Britain, as well as maritime component commanders course for flag officers in Italy. I have had 3 seagoing commands and that of SA Navy Fleet. Before the current assignment, I was assigned to Joint Operations Division of the South African National Defence Force as Chief of Staff. I am a graduate of US Naval War College, as well as SA National Defence College. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great honor to invite the Chief of the South African Navy, who will deliver the opening statement for this prestigious event. Chief of the Navy, sir.
Thanks, Rear Admiral Mhlana. The Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, the Honorable Ms. Mutshekga, Acting Secretary for Defense of South Africa, Dr. Gamede, the CEO of AMSCO, Advocate Mbada, the Chief of Umbutho Eswatini Defense Force, General Fakutse, the Chief of the Zimbabwean Defense Force, General Sibanda, the Chiefs of Navies in attendance, heads of delegation representing your defense forces and navies, members of the Plenary Defense Staff Council, members of the Military Attaches Advisory Court, generals and admirals, the Dean of the Faculty of Military Science of the University of Stellenbosch, Professor Tsetla, councillors and officials of the City of Cape Town, officers commanding of ships and shore units, officers, captains of industry, esteemed members of academia, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the Seapower for Africa Symposium 2024, held here in Cape Town, South Africa. You are in the mother city, near the remarkable location of the Cape of Good Hope, Choke Point, where 2 vast oceans converge. You are near the southern tip of the great African continent. Whilst here, you must not miss the breathtaking view of Table Mountain and one of the C7 wonders of nature and the stunning landscape of the nearby wine district. Embrace the heterogeneity of South Africa, a unique crossroad where the legacies of Africa, Europe, and Middle East and Asia converge in its people's cuisines, religion, culture. Welcome to South Africa. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to each of you for accepting my invitation to this significant event and for carving out time from your busy life and careers to attend the Seapower for Africa Symposium 2024. Thank you. Navies are an instrument of maritime security cooperation. 90% of Africa's trade is by sea, highlighting the importance of the maritime arena to Africa, which consists of developing countries, with 70% of the countries being coastal or inland countries. Delays in the delivery of cargo have the potential of causing unwanted socio-economic consequences in many affected states. Maritime trade and maritime security are thus essential for the economic growth of the continent as well as for our daily livelihood. Ladies and gentlemen, all states have to ensure maritime security, as over 80% of world trade by volume and 70% by value are by the sea and may be higher in underdeveloped nations. The maritime security matrix developed by BEGA consists of 4 components: national security, maritime safety, economic development, and human security. The 4 concepts need not to be integrated, but this matrix is a tool for how different actors might understand and interpret maritime security. The 2050 South Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy identified threats and vulnerabilities such as transnational organized crime, illegal unreported, unregulated fishing, environmental crime, and natural disasters, just to mention a few to the African maritime domain. Africa must effectively combat these threats because it will hinder economic development, exacerbate food security issues, and weaken African governments. In other words, a lot of Africa's new risks come from the water, which threatens human security and economic development. When utilizing the maritime security matrix, the focus of the 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy is more towards economic development, blue economy, and human security, which is resilience. I believe that the exclusion of interstate maritime dispute or conflicts was a serious oversight on the part of the 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy and national security in the form of Seapower. Plays an important role in maritime security. Seapower is the essence of any navy, be it blue, green, brown navy. The military role of a navy relates to protection of national interests, the protection of our country's seas, lines of communications. It ensures international order at sea. It facilitates freedom of trade and movement on the high seas. Thus, the military role covers the maritime security matrix developed by BEGA. The diplomatic role threatens relationships and cooperation on both military and political levels. The policing or consular role is generally performed by coast guards or divided between various agencies or jointly. This role promotes the basic interests of coastal states, protection of sovereignty, resources, and good order at sea. For the developing countries, Coast Guard's responsibilities and nation building represent the extent of their naval responsibilities, either due to international, regional stability, or financial limitations. In Africa, this role is done by navies in support of other governmental agencies due to financial limitations. This is the challenge facing African navies. It must be emphasized that the military role-oriented navies can perform both diplomatic and policing roles. The training required to perform law enforcement functions within territorial waters differs from military training that naval sailors receive. Navies must have relationships with other arms of services internally and other militaries externally in order to perform their functions and exercises their skills. Coast Guard's functions rely on relationships with civilian organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, the African maritime security can be enhanced through naval cooperation. Cooperation between navies is inherent in their operating procedures as well as through diplomatic roles. Cooperation between navies in conducting patrols in the maritime arena of Africa is essential if Africa is to meet the emerging threats and challenges to its maritime security. isiXhosa is one of the 11 official languages here in South Africa, and it happens to be my first language. A direct translation of the word Sisonke from isiXhosa means together or we are together. However, if you ask the meaning from people who speak my language, the common response will be unity, togetherness, we are in it together. Sisonke is our crucial African values. Africa, Sisonke is in this maritime insecurity. Sisonke, we can turn it around. Other nations must find us together. Sisonke. The African Renaissance Institute defines African Renaissance, and I quote, a shift in the consciousness of the individual to re-establish our diverse traditional African values so as to embrace the individual's responsibility to the community and the fact that he or she in community with others. Together, we are in charge of our destination, unquote. Therefore, Sisonke is in line with African Renaissance. African navies must strive to cooperation to ensure the maritime security of the continent. The focus must be on togetherness through action utilizing the continental, regional, and national initiatives to ensure maritime security. Several initiatives focus on cooperation in the maritime security arena. The 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy, the SADC Maritime Security Strategy, and the Yaoundé Code of Conduct are examples of such initiatives, and they lay the foundation to take action. Sisonke. The 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy is the overarching document that should be utilized by all African nations to establish cooperation. The strategic end state has been defined as follows. I quote, increased wealth creation from African maritime domain that positively contribute to the socio-economic development as well as increased national, regional, continental stability through collaborative, concerted cooperation, coordinated, coherent, and trust-building multi-layered efforts to build blocks of maritime sector activities, concert with improving elements of maritime governance, unquote. This is Sisonke realizing that it is only through a combination of efforts that African nations can secure the African maritime domain. The cooperation of African nations must also be implemented in conjunction with existing and relevant African Union, national and international regulatory frameworks and ongoing maritime initiatives in Africa. I would like to highlight two important concepts. First, the establishment of a combined exclusive maritime zone of Africa, CEMZA. CEMZA is anticipated to provide Africa with significant cross-cutting advantages in terms of geostrategic, economic, political, social, and security benefits, since it will foster cooperation and, however, the risk associated with all international threats and poor environmental management. Aiming to boost intra-Africa trade, the CEMZA is a concept that aims to remove or streamline administrative procedures in intra-African Union maritime transport to make it more appealing, efficient, and competitive, as well as to do more to protect the environment. Establishing the CEMZA will diligently assist in ensuring the African continent's maritime security, especially from enforcement and governing point of view. Thus, by extension, related to naval activities, operations, and navies as a whole. I believe that the nature and role of navies can assist in this regard, whilst the orders process of establishing the CEMZA is underway. The second concept is interagency transnational cooperation and coordination on maritime safety and security. The crux of this concept is maritime domain awareness, and how to enhance the African maritime domain awareness. A naval component capability within the framework of the African Standby Force and the establishment of a representative continental working group of chiefs of navies, chiefs of African navies, and coast guards are steps towards promoting interagency and transnational cooperation and coordination on maritime safety and security. These groups will examine situational awareness issues and work together to improve maritime safety and security. Since the establishment of the 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy 12 years ago, few or none of the objectives have been achieved. The objectives speak directly to Sisonke on paper. Sisonke is alive, the foundation and the building blocks are in place. It is time to build the house, and the builders are the African navies and coast guards because of the nature of their roles. The establishment of regional maritime headquarters and Maritime Operational Coordination Center is lagging and must come online and function properly, as this will indeed coordinate the patrolling of African maritime domain and ensure that African maritime security is enhanced. Regional maritime headquarters and maritime operational coordination centers are key to realize the 10 objectives that were set out for establishing enhanced maritime security in the African maritime domain. Out of the 38 coastal states in Africa, none has sufficient assets to ensure maritime security in their maritime domains, including the adjacent maritime areas in securities that could affect their prosperity or economic development. Furthermore, most of these coastal states, if not all, have no financial muscle to acquire the required and appropriate assets. Therefore, the African states have no choice but to be together. Sisonke, as the Heritage Special Report of 2005 rightly says, I quote, "In this era of international terrorists, narcotics traffickers, and sophisticated transnational crimes, either the world's navies and coast guards will command the high seas, or non-state actors will exploit the power vacuum for the unlawful purpose," unquote. Again, Sisonke will command the sea, not individuals. Sisonke is an African solution to the African challenges of maritime insecurity. The concept of SEMSA, ASF, and chance can work if Sisonke is the African way. But as Innocent A. Daudu stated, I quote, "African Renaissance goes beyond excellent rhetoric or justification of a philosophy. It requires commitment to duty and a strong will to bring about a transformed Africa," unquote. He further stated that, I quote, "The need for unity among people of African descent has gained wide acceptance as a way of enhancing solidarity, as well as mobilizing resources that are required to improve the African image and prospects," unquote. I therefore propose, because of limited financial resources dedicated to the maritime arena, African navies are obliged to perform Coast Guard's roles even though they are not equipped or trained for this purpose, for this role. Therefore, Africans have no choice but to work on the principle of Sisonke. African maritime security can be enhanced through cooperation and specifically cooperation between the navies. Cooperation between navies is inherent in their operating procedures through multinational exercises, multinational operation, and exchange programs at all levels of training, as well as in their diplomatic roles. Cooperation between navies in conducting patrols in the maritime arena of Africa is essential if Africa is to meet the emerging threats and challenges to its maritime security. It is only through cooperation that we can face the threats to our survival head-on. I am further of the opinion that the warriors of the seas, our navies and coast guards, can and must play a more engaging role. As previously mentioned, cooperation is in the blood of navies, coast guards, and must utilize this. The proper functioning of the regional domain awareness and maritime operational coordination centers must be prioritized. However, nothing is preventing the navies and coast guards to patrol together or on behalf of each other. This means that should South Africa could conduct a patrol in the exclusive economic zone of the west coast of South Africa, it could extend the patrols to cover the area beyond the exclusive zone, the exclusive economic zone of the south coast of Namibia and vice versa. Since the patrols is conducted on the high seas, there should be no concern about diplomatic clearances. If neighboring countries have vessels available, combined coordinated patrols could also be conducted in territorial seas. Furthermore, each coastal state must have a memorandum of understanding or maritime security cooperation with its coastal neighbors. This will ensure coverage of the entire Africa. For example, South Africa has a tripartite memorandum of understanding on security cooperation with the Republic of Tanzania and Mozambique in the east. In the west, the Maritime Security Cooperation Memorandum of Understanding is being drafted, and soon it will be signed between South Africa and Namibia. This allows for incapable states to benefit from capable states, resulting in the mutual benefit of maritime security that promotes economic development for Africa. Chance must focus on the 10 objectives that it has been charged with by 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Security Strategy, and establish workshops and engagements at least twice a year as a starting point. Naval exercises between African navies and coast guards must be executed regularly with a focus on green water operations such as visit, boat search and seizure, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations to ensure the honing of skills and standard operating procedures. For example, the African countries can all schedule their maritime exercises with each other during 1 year and the maritime exercises with international navies during alternative years. This will allow Africa to remain on par with other international navies and at the same time ensure that cooperation and interoperability exist within Africa. Integration of national maritime domain awareness centers with regional maritime domain awareness centers will ensure that information is shared and appropriate action can be taken. If integration of maritime domain awareness centers is cumbersome or impractical because of any reasons, coastal states should immediately commence entering into a memorandum of agreement to ensure information of common interest to contribute to maritime security. In conclusion, the former president of South Africa, the father of our nation, said, and I quote, "The sea is a vital national interest, and that is why we maintain the Navy. As a nation, we believe in the freedom of the seas. That is a matter of national strategic interest. We are a maritime nation trading all over the world. We accept our obligation to combine with other maritime nations to uphold the freedom of the seas and protect our national interest through naval power. After all, as my former director of maritime affairs says, if you don't monitor or patrol your maritime domain, then you don't own it. You just have access to it. Just like everyone, and one day you might be denied that access. The time for depending on external forces is over. It is our time to rise up and take our destiny into our own hands. That is African Renaissance. Sisonke, siyanqoba, together we are victorious. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce the keynote speaker for today's opening of the Seapower for Africa Symposium. The Honorable Minister was appointed in her portfolio from 3rd July this year. She is an educator by profession, holding several degrees from various universities in this field. She has extensive experience in government, both at provincial and at national level. She has served as director in the office of President Mandela for 3 years and was also elected chairperson of the African National Congress Women's League since 2007. She was the Minister of Basic Education for a period of 15 years before her recent appointment as the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans. The South African National Defense Force, and specifically the South African Navy, is very grateful to have a leader of her caliber leading our National Defense Force at this moment, at this most critical time in our history. As Chief of the Navy, I am delighted and humbled for the Minister to make time out of her busy schedule to come and attend this Seapower for Africa Symposium and to address us all here this morning. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, Chiefs of Navies, heads of delegation here today, I don't have to mention that without political support, our attempts to address the maritime security challenges of our continent will not succeed. As maritime security specialists, we know what must be done to overcome these challenges. However, many African governments have to overcome so many socio-economic challenges that in many instances the defense forces have to stand at the back of the line when it comes to funding. That is exactly where a strong political leader is required to fight our battles in the corridors of government power. I am proud to say today that we could not have received a better minister for this role. So, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to request all of you to stand and to welcome the guest of honor for this morning, the Honorable Minister of Defense and Veterans, Ms. Angie Motshekga. I thank you.
Thank you very much. No, thank you. I always report to colleagues that I'm used to an environment where we can say, please sit down. So, but in this space, there are different protocols. So, Program Director, let me first acknowledge our Chief of the South African Navy, Vice Admiral Monde Lobese. Also acknowledge the Acting Secretary for Defense, Dr. Tobekile Gamete. Warmly welcome our foreign delegates that are here, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation and coming to our beautiful country. We pride ourselves that we have one of the most beautiful countries. So let me thank you very much for accepting and visiting us. Let me acknowledge Babu Fakude from Eswatini, General Mashiliki Sana Fakude. Also acknowledge General from Zimbabwe, Sibanda. Also acknowledge the Chiefs of Navies and delegations in attendance of the Seapower for Africa Symposium. Acknowledge Chief of the South African Army represented by Major General Mekyo, Chief of our Air Force, Babumbambo. Also acknowledge our CEO from AMSCO, members of the Military Attaché and Advisory Corps, members of the Plenary Defense Staff Council, generals and admirals, officers commanding of ships and shore units, our senior officers, junior officers, masters of the South African Navy, Master Warrant, Tatemulife, captains of the industry that are present, ladies and gentlemen. Again, good morning, Absheni, Molweni, Ndimachero, More, We have 11 official languages, so it's still the same thing translated in different ways for our guests. But in short, I'm saying good morning. As our chief has said, as a country, we pride ourselves that we are indeed a maritime nation, endowed with a double geopolitical identity, which is land and the sea. From the land-sea side, our country is seen as one of the gateways into the African continent, whilst from the ocean side, our country has an international search and rescue responsibility for area hotel, as well as hydrographic responsibility for navigation area 7. And these are two vast areas which necessitate from our side a large and capable navy. But also our country is also situated along a strategic maritime trade choke point along the African coast. And this we regard as double blessing, which shapes a large degree of our maritime and naval interest as a nation. We also pride ourselves that we are strategically situated along vital sea routes of the world, the South African, Indian, and the South Ocean Atlantic. We have a coastline of about 3,900 kilometers, along which maritime resources are spread, ranging from the Orange River in the west to Punta to Oro in the east. However, South Africa is but one of 38 coastal states in our continent. And many of maritime security challenges, as the Chief Navy has said, that lots of challenges that we experience and are echoed by these countries as well, and hence the importance of us working together. The other 16 landlocked African countries are also dependent on their trade on those fellow African countries endowed with access to the world trade routes. Again, as the program director said, 90% of our trade as a continent is done through the sea. So which means all of us, even those landlocked and those who have coastal access, depend on each other, and there is a need for synergy and cooperation. So the geostrategic position of the African continent in world trade is concentrated in 3 choke points along our continent. These are the Straits of Gibraltar, which separates Africa from Europe, the Suez Canal in the Red Sea, that serves as a main maritime trade route between Asia and Europe, and South Africa. It's also the third. So should these 3 choke points all experience challenges simultaneously, the vast majority of world trade will come to a standstill. All of you are actually acutely aware that all coastal states have a responsibility to monitor and protect their maritime zones, maritime resources, maritime ecology, and conservation, as well as their maritime trade. And all of these factors carry with them immediate national, regional, and international obligations and responsibilities. The geographic position of the African continent, along with the interconnectivity of the African maritime domain, makes maritime cooperation and information sharing within the African continent and the world non-negotiable. So in a word, Chief Navy, indeed, sisonke, because we can rise together, but we can also fall together, all of us as members of this continent. And this requires an integrated approach, which is a cornerstone of the African Integrated Maritime Security Strategy 2063. So the 5th Seapower for Africa Symposium 2024 is currently the only rendezvous on the African continent, which brings together senior maritime Navy minds, and for that we're grateful and very appreciative. That also brings a strategic blend of maritime academia, that interrogates maritime threats and challenges for the entire continent. Indeed, Chief Navy, I've gone through the program and can say I'm extremely impressed with the lineup of what the symposium is going to address, and very appreciative that we will be able to access it also through other media platforms if we're not able to spend the entire period with yourselves. But just from an intellectual level, I would have loved to really sit here and be part of this academic and interrogative engagements that we are going to have here. So for me, the strategic importance of holding regular Seapoint for Africa Symposium is critical for the eradication of current as well as future challenges, threats that are confronting us as a people of the continent, and all other challenges, as I say, within the African maritime domain. As a government of South Africa, therefore by extension the people of the Republic of South Africa, we'd like to warmly welcome all the delegates and participants of the 5th Seapower for Africa Symposium 2024 to the shores of South Africa, and would like to wish you all a pleasant and safe stay in our country. The Ministry of Defense wants to articulate its wishes for a productive symposium that will propel the accelerated milestone implementation of the African Integrated Maritime Security Strategy 2063. Let the 5th Seapower for Africa Symposium 2024 be the gyroscope that provides a reference direction for maritime cooperation and information sharing within the African continent and the world. I want to say fair winds and following seas for the duration of the symposium, all present. Indeed, I wish you a great symposium, productive symposium, and we'll be looking forward to the outcomes of the symposium. And indeed, CNAV can promise that we have our undivided support for all the work and the great work that our Navy is doing in protecting our country, but also in propelling our economy and making sure that all goes well. And I want to thank the delegates again for honoring us with your presence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. We will now proceed with the official photo session, and I kindly ask all the dignitaries, including our speakers, Chief of Navies, and international partners, to please join us in front of Hall 6 for a group photo, and the procedure is as follows. First photo is only the Minister of Defense and the heads of delegations. Then the second photo, we will all join the Minister and our chiefs in that photo. All photos will be taken in standing position. We will be arranged outside there. Probably the height will determine where you stand. So thank you very much. I now invite you to proceed to the front of Hall 6. Thank you.
Honorable Minister of Defense and Veteran Affairs, Honorable Angie Motseha, all the honorables and excellencies here present, and representatives of our governments, Acting Secretary for Defense, Dr. Kamente, Chief of the South African Navy, Vice Admiral Lobesi, Chief of Defense Forces of Eswatini, General Fagutse from Eswatini, and Chief of Defense Force of Zimbabwe, General Sibanda, all chiefs of navies here present, members of the Military Attaché Corps, members of the Plenary Defense Staff Council, generals and admirals, all chiefs of naval staffs, all senior, junior officers, and master of the South African Navy, all representatives of the navies and armed forces here present, all captains of industries, all media and invited guests, all protocol observed. Good morning. I am Rear Admiral Junior Grade Sachias Randy Kontep, Deputy Navy Commander of the Namibian Navy. It's a pleasure to be here today as we delve into the topic of paramount importance, which is maritime security. As we navigate an increasingly complex global landscape, the safety and security of our maritime domain have never been more critical. From piracy and smuggling to cyber threats and environmental challenges, the seas we rely on for survival, trade, and communication face a multitude of risks. The implications of these challenges extend beyond our shores, affecting economies, national security, and stability of entire regions. Today, we'll explore not only the current threats, but also the collaborative measures that can be taken to enhance our maritime security framework. I would like to start with a quote of Vice Admiral Mudimu when the first symposium was held in Cape Town. Opening quotes. The focus of the symposium has been the establishment of a collective approach to collaboration and cooperation to address the maritime challenges that face Africa. Closing quotes. The origin of the Seapower for Africa Symposium concept was initiated by some African chiefs of navies back in 2003 at an international Seapower Symposium held in 2023 at Rhode Island in the USA. The first Seapower Symposium was held in Cape Town, Republic of South Africa, by the South African Navy. It was known as SPAS 2005, with the theme of harnessing the power of the sea for Africa. The second SPAS was held in Abuja, Nigeria, hosted by the Nigerian Navy, known as SPAS 2006, with the theme Cooperation and Development for Enhancement of Africa's Maritime Capabilities. The third SPAS was held again in Cape Town, RSA, by the South African Navy, SPAS 2009, with the theme Towards Effective Maritime Governance for Africa. The fourth SPAS was hosted in Abuja, Nigeria, by the Nigerian Navy, SPAS 2021, with the theme Integrating Africa's Maritime Domain Awareness Infrastructure Towards Effective Ocean Governments. This year, the fifth SPAS is hosted for the third time in Cape Town by the South African Navy, known as SPAS 2024, with a theme, Good Order at Sea in the African Maritime Domain. ladies and gentlemen, the Director of Ceremonies, the purpose of this event this year, at PAS 24, is to provide a forum for African naval leadership to discuss common maritime challenges and opportunities to enhance maritime security and cooperation on the African continent. We will be looking at some objectives of this SPAS, aims 2050, non-traditional maritime security, which is the theme of the day, and then we'll conclude. The objectives of this symposium is to review current hydrographic capabilities of member states towards better ocean governments. Secondly, appraising existing collaborative regional frameworks for maritime security. Third, addressing issues and challenges of integrating maritime domain awareness, capabilities for enhanced security. And fourth, raising any existing issues of maritime boundary delimitations for shared resolutions. And lastly, laying the foundation framework for sustainable ocean governance in Africa. Aims 2050. The African countries came up with 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy, which is known as APES 2050, at the African Union level to maximize the African maritime domain awareness to benefit and create wealth for all Africans. The strategy consists of the overarching, concerted, and coherent long-term multi-layered plans of action that will achieve the objectives of the African Union to enhance maritime viability for a prosperous Africa. In developing this AIMS 2050 integrated maritime strategy, it is recognized that the African maritime domain has vast potential for wealth creation. Also, is the realization that African Union member states have common maritime challenges and opportunities, and indeed significant responsibilities for generating a desirable political will for implementation of this strategy. The vision of this strategy is the overarching vision to foster increased wealth creation from African oceans and seas by developing a sustainable, thriving blue economy in a secure and environmentally sustainable manner. The goals of this strategy are a comprehensive understanding of existing and potential challenges, including allocation of resources to identified priorities over a predetermined time frame, a comprehensive, concerted, coherent, and coordinated approach that improves maritime conditions with respect to environmental and socio-economic development, as well as capacity to generate wealth from sustainable governance of Africa's seas and oceans. A common template for the African Union, the regional committees, and relevant organizations and member states to guide maritime review, budgetary planning, and effective allocation of resources in order to enhance maritime viability for an integrated and prosperous Africa. A business plan that specifies milestones, capacity building targets, and implementation requirements, including technical and financial support from within Africa and also from the development partners. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the theme of today, the non-traditional maritime security threats. Some examples of this are piracy and armed robbery, whereby attacks on vessels pose risk to shipping and crew safety, human trafficking and smuggling, the use of maritime routes for trafficking people or smuggling goods, including drugs and weapons, environmental crimes, illegal fishing, dumping of hazardous waste, and oil spills that threatens maritime ecosystems and biodiversity. Terrorism, attacks on maritime infrastructure, including ports and ships, as well as the use of maritime routes for terrorist activities. And cyber threats, vulnerabilities in navigation and communication systems can be exploited by criminals, impacting maritime operations and safety. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing undermines sustainable fishing practices and threatens the livelihoods of our people. Climate change, rising sea levels, and extreme weather can disrupt maritime trade routes and affect coastal security. Resource competition, tensions arising from competition for maritime resources, including minerals and energy, particularly in contested areas. Migration crises. Mass migration by sea can lead to humanitarian crises and strain coastal nations' resources, safety, and security of our people. An invasive species. The spread of non-native marine species via ships can disrupt local ecosystems and fisheries. These threats require comprehensive strategies that involve international cooperation, regulatory frameworks, and enhanced maritime governance. Themes for today. Theme 1, security, strategy, and diplomacy. Theme 2, hidden maritime security dilemmas. These are what we are going to concentrate on today. And to conclude, I encourage each delegate to share his or her insights and experience and expertise as we work together to address these pressing maritime security issues. Let's embark on this crucial conversation and work towards a safer maritime environment for all. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Navy Commander of the Namibian Navy, for your very comprehensive introduction to the proceedings of today. I will now move on swiftly to panel 1 discussions, which will be covering the topic of security, strategy, and diplomacy. The chair of that panel 1 discussion will be Professor Nel. And just a short introduction of Professor Nel. She is the Vice Dean of Social Impact and Personnel and an Associated Professor in Criminal and Military Law at the Faculty of Military Science at the University of Stellenbosch. Professor Nel, thank you.
Admirals, Generals, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to chair the first panel for this amazing opportunity that we have today. I would just like to call my panel members, please, if I can ask Captain Xian Shen, please to join us on the podium, Dr. Van Dijk and Professor Otto. In the interest of time management, you are most welcome to read the very impressive bios of all the panel members who are, which was made available on the program for you. So I will go straight to where we want to listen to. First speaker will be Senior Navy Captain Xia Shen from the People's Republic of China, with his topic on building a maritime community with a shared future and maintaining peace and security at sea for Africa. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Professor Neil, distinguished guests, good morning. I'm Senior Captain Liu Xianchen, came from Chinese Imperial Navy. I'm very pleased to participate in the Peacepower of Africa Symposium 2024 to exchange views with experts and colleagues on such topics as good order at sea in the African maritime domain, no traditional maritime security, and capacity building for navies. Although China and Africa are thousands of miles apart, we are as close as family and share a long-standing friendship. Just over a month ago, on September 5th, the 2024 Summit for Firm on China-Africa Cooperation was held in Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a keynote speech titled "Joining Hands to Advance Modernization and Build a Community with a Shared Future," proposing that the overall characterization of China-Africa relations be elevated to an all-weather China-Africa community with a shared future for the new era. President Xi proposed that China and Africa work together to advance 6 modernization, including jointly advanced modernization underpinned by peace and security. In the next 3 years, China will work with Africa to take 10 partnership actions for modernization, one of which is the partnership action for common security. In recent years, China has put forward the Global Security Initiative, offering a new path for the international community to bridge differences, resolve disputes, and jointly address security challenges. China stays alongside Africa in promoting the implementation of the GSA, fostering solutions to regional hotshot issues, injecting strong impetus for upholding world peace and tranquility. Livelihood is a key factor to security and stability in Africa. Currently, some African participants in Belt and Road cooperation projects are developing their economies and improving its livelihood in a safe environment. This is a comprehensive approach to address American security problems. Based on the almost preference of Africa, no interference in Africa's internal affairs, and the basic norms of international relations. China actively explores constructive participation in affairs causing African peace and security. China supports that African people in solving African issues in the African way, and is a long-standing supporter of the leading role of the American Union and America's sub-region organizations in resolving regional conflicts. We support and contribute to the implementation of silencing the guns in Africa and the outlook on peace and development in the Horn of Africa. We implement security assistance projects in Belt and Road cooperation and social security areas to enhance African countries' independent peace, stability, and counter-terrorism capabilities. Since China's participation in the United Nations peacekeeping operations in 1990, over 8% of our peacekeepers have been deployed in Africa, making it the biggest peacekeeper contributor to the region among permanent members of the UN Security Council. From Mali to the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of South Sudan, from man clearance, road construction to escorts and volunteer medical consolidations. Chinese blue helmets have been awarded the UN Peace Medals for their dedication and commitment to maintain peace in Africa. With almost 7 decades for dedicated work, China-Africa relationship is at the best in history, and our mutual beneficial cooperation has reached unprecedented heights, offering exceptional opportunities for China and Africa to carry out maritime security cooperation, jointly safeguard peace and security in America's maritime domain, and build a good order at the sea. Please allow me to take the chance to introduce an important concept of building a good order at the sea and safeguarding maritime security, that is, building a maritime community with a shared future. On April 23, 2019, Chinese President Xi Jinping initiated the key concept of building a maritime community with a shared future at 17th anniversary of the Chinese PM Navy. What is a maritime community with a shared future? I would like to interpret it from 2 dimensions. First, from man and nature perspective, oceans and people are in a community of harmonious coexistence. The ocean is the source of life, a living space, a reservoir of resources, and a lifeline of transportation. The ocean naturalizes human civilization. Second, a people-to-people perspective. Humans are living in communities of shared interest, security, responsibilities, and cultures because of the ocean. From the bigger marine ecosystem, maritime trade, maritime transportation, to a small merchant ship sailing at the sea with a crew and cargo, they all carry the interest different community with a shared future is to create peaceful, secure, prosperous, open, inclusive, clean, and beautiful seas and oceans. To build a maritime community with a shared future is to jointly address maritime security threats, jointly promote maritime prosperity and development, jointly advance the integration of maritime cultures, and jointly protect the marine ecological environment. Peace and prosperity, as well as good order, serve as the basic objectives and the cornerstones for building a maritime community with a shared future. We promote common security, respecting and accommodating legitimate concerns of all parties regard maritime security rather than seek one's own security at the expense of others. We promote comprehensive security, considering the historical and current context of maritime security issues in a holistic manner, adopting multi-pronged approaches, implementing integrated measures, and tackling root causes as well. We uphold collaborative security through dialogue and cooperation, promoting maritime security with enhanced communication, seeking common ground while respecting difference, fostering mutual trust, reducing misunderstanding, broadening cooperation area, innovating collaboration methods, and striving for peace through cooperation and security through collaboration. We champion sustainable security, developing together for deeper integration of interests and resolving conflicts and disputes through shared goals, thereby achieving a dynamic balance between security and development. Over the past 5 years, the Chinese initiative of building a maritime community with a shared future has become a generally agreed concept and gained wide-ranging recognition. The Chinese PR Navy has been vigorously safeguarding the security of regional and strategic sea line of communication through ocean-going escorts, international rescues, and medical service. The PR Navy has continued to provide maritime public security goods and services for the international community. As of August 2024, over 150 ships in 46 planned ETGs has been dispatched for 16 consecutive 6 years. In April 2023, 2 ships of the PRA ETGs were sent to evacuate 1,171 Chinese and foreign nationals from Sudan. The PRN hospital ship Archbeast, nicknamed a Big White Ship by international friends, has provided medical service to nearly 2,090 souls from 45 countries. The ship, symbolizing love and hope, has become an expression and a well-known brand of the initiative of building a maritime community with a shared future. Since its combination, Archbeast has paid port calls to many American countries and provide quality medical service. In late August, the ship had just made a port call to Cape Town and provide medical service for 3,700 people. Medical teams performed operations on board. SME units also carried out joint treatments in local hospitals and academic exchange with the South African colleagues in Cape Town. The hospital ship Archbeast is now at African domain in African maritime domain. In Mission Harmony 2024, it has just visited Seychelles, Tanzania, Madagascar, and Mozambique. I heard the latest news. She will go to the burning. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, today, the world has entered a new period of turbulence and transformation. Africa is located at the junction of the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, surrounded by important SOCs. Among the 54 African countries, 38 are coastal or island countries, with a coastline of 47,000 kilometers. Over 9% of the country's imports and exports are transported by sea. In recent years, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Guinea have become hotspots of Africa and even the world with emerging maritime threats, such as piracy and armed assaults on ships. The escalating conflicts in the Middle East have further increased the risk of the Red Sea shipping, leading to a continuous rise in premium of vessels passing through the region. According to the International Maritime Bureau's Piracy Reporting Center, the water of the COG account for 95% of the pirate attacks and hostage-taking in the case worldwide in 2022. In addition, Africa has long been facing no traditional security threats, such as terrorist attacks, drugs and arms trafficking, proliferation of small arms, human trafficking, climate change, food security, spread of infectious diseases, and illegal fishing. The Global Terrorism Index 2022 states that among the top 10 countries with the highest casualties in global terrorist attacks, 5 are sub-Saharan American countries, where consecutive terrorist attacks have caused a large number of civilians to be displaced and homeless. The fragile ecosystem in Africa are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as rising temperature, droughts, floods, and other natural disasters, leading to a reduced food production and widespread famine. How to tackle the above-mentioned non-traditional security threats? I think we can act on the global security initiatives and the concept of building a maritime community with a shared future. Here, I would like to use an excellent interpretation on Oceans with a Shared Future by Admiral Hu Zhongming, commander of the Chinese Imperial Navy. Security is the first priority for a shared future. Maritime security concerns the safety and the interests of all countries. It is imperative to uphold the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, continuously improve regional maritime security, architecture, establish mechanisms for cooperation and coordination, and provide the international community with more and better public security goods. Harmony is the essence of the shared future. Countries need to respect each other's sovereignty, territory integrity, and legitimate and reasonable security concerns. Furthermore, it requires our reservists and candidates in order to achieve peaceful coexistence between nations and harmony between humanity and the sea. Inclusiveness is the key to a shared future. It is imperative to be broad-minded, magnanimous, and as inclusive as the ocean, and correctly view each other's reasonable development. Let us choose openness and inclusiveness instead of isolation and exclusiveness. Transcend barriers and conflicts through actions and manual learning. Partners are the foundation of the shared future. We ought to have regular interactions at all levels to enhance friendship and trust. We can actively engage in shape with and exchange between younger officers, experts, and scholars. We may deepen our cooperation in fields like information sharing, personnel training, and joint exercise, and training to build a new maritime security partnership based on the mutual respect, equality, mutual trust, and win-win cooperation. The acronym of security, harmony, inclusiveness, and partners is a ship, a symbol of the sea and the navy. The ship consists with the connotation of Chinese proverb 同舟共济, when our common boats cross the river peacefully together. Africa is indispensable to world peace and development, and greater progress in Africa will bring more hope and light to the world. China is ready to work with African countries towards the brighter vision of a security community and to make a new contribution to resolving the global security deficits and maintaining lasting peace and universal security in the region and the world. Thank you very much.
Captain, thank you very much for your insights into the role of the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy in the maritime domain and promoting security. Now, we have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations, but we do not always have the opportunity to talk about the Chinese role. So I would like to maybe, if there's one or two questions at this stage, if anybody maybe have a question for the captain, we can entertain a question. Otherwise, we can just move on to the next one and then leave the questions until the end. Anybody who maybe wants to ask a question? Yes, sir.
He talked about the building maritime community with shared future, and he focused in Africa and China only. I think the maritime security is international effort, not only Africa and China. Because if you see the map, the maritime security and world trade is connected with Asia, Middle East, what happened now in the southern part of the Red Sea, and connected to the Mediterranean Sea and also to the Indian Ocean. So this one must be collectively understood of what is the shape future of maritime security and connecting with all these very important also strategic choke points. So we need him to elaborate on this if he can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your comment, sir. Captain, do you have any response to that if you want?
You are more time. If I can answer this question after another speech.
Sure.
Okay?
No problem. We'll keep a pin in that one, and then. Let's maybe move on to the next speaker, Dr. George van Dijk. He's from Ghana. He will be talking to us about the adaptive maritime security, developing resilient strategies for safeguarding African waters in a dynamic threat environment. Dr. van Dijk, the floor is yours.
I'd like to stand on existing protocols. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to be here to share this particular presentation on adaptive maritime security. So Africa's maritime sector contributes a lot to our economies. If you take a country like Togo, the maritime sector contributes over 70% to their GDP, and especially their ports. But where you have your maritime sector contributing to your economy, you also have a lot of maritime threats. And these threats have implications, be it local, regional, or international. So our traditional maritime strategies, we find these days, are not exactly working, and they are inadequate because our threats are complex, they are evolving, and they are unpredictable. So this is the essence of this presentation, to look at adaptive strategies that can work for our dynamic threat environment here in Africa, or in our African waters. So today I'm going to talk about, just glaze over, maritime security complexity in Africa, and I'm sure those of you sitting in front of me know way more about this than I do. We'll talk about maritime security strategy in general, look at complex adaptive systems theory, and then see how we can apply that by just coming up with some core principles for an adaptive maritime security strategy. So just quickly to look at the key threats that we face here in Africa. Piracy and armed robbery at sea have been issues for a long time. We talk about the Gulf of Aden and more recently the Gulf of Guinea. We have a lot of piracy and armed robbery incidents happening. Some are reported, some are not reported. Just as a side note, I had a student who was a cadet on a ship that was taken hostage in the Gulf of Guinea, and he had to maneuver the ship back to a port in Ghana on his own, with the cook serving as the engine officer. And these are some of the things that are going on in our waters. We have illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which has been predominant for many, many years. Trafficking of arms, drugs, and human beings. It's been spoken about this morning extensively. But we also have environmental degradation, and this is also due to a lot of rapid urbanization. A lot of people are moving to the coast and will continue to move to the coast. And this is causing a lot of issues within our coastal environments, but also changes that we see due to climate change. There are a lot of places where sea defenses are being put up because there's a lot of coastal erosion. And then last but not the least on the list, not to say that it's not important, it's probably the most topical issue today, which is maritime terrorism, which is becoming quite a talked about issue. It's not a new issue, but it is being talked about quite a bit because of the happenings in the Red Sea and how it affects commercial shipping. So looking at these key threats, we also have unique challenges. We have vast coastline, over 30,000 kilometers in Africa to take care of. We have limited resources and also limited capacity for maritime law enforcement. Maybe I'll just throw in here limited resources and maybe sometimes a lack of prioritization when it comes to the allocation of resources for security. We also have overlapping jurisdictions when it comes to agencies and also sovereignty issues when we're dealing with transnational crimes. So I want us to think about threats in a different context. We are aware of a lot of traditional threats that we have here in Africa. I've divided it into 4 extant threats, which are our traditional threats. These are current threats that we are aware of. We are monitoring them. We are trying to deal with them. They've been there for a long time, so we can characterize them very well. But then we also have evolving threats as well, which are actively developing. They are happening, and we need to take action on them. They haven't fully matured, but they are developing. Thirdly, we have prospective threats. Again, these are speculative threats. They are potential future threats. We can see that this or that may happen, but then they haven't fully materialized, and the question is, how do we deal with these sort of threats? And lastly, we have our stochastic disruptions, which are more of what we call our black swan events, things that we cannot predict, but then have very serious effects on us. And this is where the issue is when we, well, from the evolving to the stochastic, when we're talking about our maritime security strategies, how do we deal with things that we don't necessarily know about? So let's look at maritime security strategy. I'm not going to give you an academic definition. I'm going to take this definition from Mariano Rajoy, who was the Spanish Prime Minister, the ex-Spanish Prime Minister. And I'm going to read it because I like what he said. He put this as a forward in Spain's maritime security strategy. He says the national maritime security strategy is based on an analysis of our environment. It reflects our maritime security interests and their vulnerabilities. It establishes shared objectives and defines lines of action aimed at orienting the use of all means to serving those objectives, both at the time of the response and in anticipation and forward planning. And I like this definition a lot because it brings out 3 key things. First of all, our strategies are based on an intimate knowledge of our maritime domain. We've been talking about maritime domain awareness for years, but we need to understand our maritime domain, what is there, what the challenges are, and how we deal with them. The second thing is we have to recognize that there are complexities in our maritime domain. There are actors, there are interactions, and there's a resulting landscape in our maritime domain. And lastly, our maritime security strategy is not a static document. It's evolving because we're not just looking at situations now, it has to be forward-thinking. So we have to look into the future as well and plan for that. So there are certain limitations of the conventional approach to developing our maritime security strategies. They are static in nature, as I said. We develop these strategies, and we often think that it's a silver bullet that can solve our problems going forward. But these strategies are unable to adapt to our changing threat environment. The strategies also can be very siloed in their approach, and they lack cross-border coordination. And this usually is as a result of the agency or the department that is responsible for putting the strategy together. So if you put this strategy under national security, then obviously it would take more of a national security focus. If you put this strategy under a different department, usually that department's footprint is felt on it, but you don't see a quite balanced approach between different agencies and departments. Our conventional approaches are rather reactive and not proactive, and usually where there's a lot of political interference, we find that there's a short-term political gains from the strategy rather than long-term security. Within our African context, we do have resource constraints limiting the implementation of our strategies. Again, we have our jurisdictional complexities, and then we have that problem of going across borders to deal with transnational crimes as well, due to sovereignty issues and due to collaborative issues. So I want to quickly go through the theory of a complex adaptive system, and then we would go to the core principles. So basically, this is a theory in science. It's about systems that are made up of many interconnected and interdependent parts, and these parts adapt and evolve in response to changes in their environment. And we want to view maritime security through the lens of complex adaptive systems, or view, yes, maritime security through the lens of complex adaptive systems. So let's look at this particular model here. We have maritime security. Yes, it's part of a system. It's part of a nested system. On the upper level, you have national security, and maritime security is part of national security. But then you have your sub-levels, which could be port, naval, maritime and coast guard, maritime surveillance, depending on the country. These are all part of the system. But this is just to say we have multiple elements within the system. So we have different stakeholders, multiple stakeholders that are interacting. We have domains that are domains for these multiple stakeholders. And then we have threats that continue to change and evolve. And we have threats that we cannot predict. So these different interactions of actors and factors, they result in the security landscape that we see today. And this is for every individual country has its own security issues. It's those series of interactions of actors and factors. And through the security landscape, there are unforeseen opportunities and there are challenges as well. So what we need is an adaptive strategy that is flexible, that ensures that we are continuously learning and adjusting, where there must be self-organization at the local level, but coordination at the higher level, and where we have feedback loops that are either positive or negative. I must state that there is no final state of security. There is no final state of security, in my opinion. It's just a continuous process of learning and adjusting, learning and adjusting. Am I good for time? Yes, okay, great. So how can CIS principles be applied to maritime security strategy? And we'll just go through some of the core principles. The first one is a decentralized decision-making with centralized coordination. So allowing local actors to make rapid decisions based on their specific context, but then within a broader strategic framework. We always talk about having a whole of government response to issues. There must be a central coordinating point, right? We want that central coordinating point, but we want to be able to respond to issues as quickly as possible. And therefore, that means that at the local level, they must be empowered also to take decisions to respond. So you maintain that centralized oversight, but then you ensure coherence and you share best practices from HQ. Second one is an iterative strategy development. So we must view strategy not as a static document, not as a silver bullet, but we should view it as an evolving document. We have to take a page out of corporate's book today. Usually, I'm traditionally a logistician. A lot of the things we learn in logistics, we learned from the military. But I think today, we need to switch the book a lot. The corporate world has seen that long-term strategies are becoming a problem. There's too much unpredictability. It's not a good way to manage risk. And so we must cut down the time. So the document must evolve. It can't be a fixed plan. We must implement regular review cycles and then look out for trigger points where we can do a strategy reassessment. For example, when something of grave concern happens. Lastly, we can maintain core strategic objectives while allowing some flexibility in our tactical objectives. The third point is a stratified threat assessment. Going back to the threat horizons that I talked about before, we must conduct multi-layered assessments that will consider those different threat horizons, and then reevaluate them as time goes on. After reevaluating them, we must have some feedback systems that we will use for continuous improvement of our system. So learning and adaptation, learning and adaptation. We must create learning networks across all our stakeholders within our maritime community, just as we have here today. Fourth one is flexible response capabilities. Developing modular and scalable response protocols, but also we must design threat category-specific response protocols as well so that we can take them and implement them, but then also have a diverse set of tools that can be used to address these various threat types that we come across. We're also asking that we emphasize cross-training of our personnel for different kinds of threats that we come across. Lastly, usually the very controversial issue of resource allocation and budgeting. The first point, implement flexible budgeting mechanisms to quickly reallocate resources. Because we are constantly learning and adapting, obviously, our resources have to be reallocated. They can't stay within the same framework. So how can we reallocate resources where they need to be prioritized? And this is what we need to think about when we are developing our strategies. We must also invest in multi-purpose capabilities that can address various threat types. Okay. So I'll just go through these very quickly because I have 3 minutes to go. I've broken down the adaptive MSS to look at specific activities that we need. This morning, in the first speech by the Commander of the Navy, he talked about integration platforms. And this is one thing we need as a technology solution, a real-time data integration platform where we are collaborating across different maritime communities. And this involves both our private sector and our public sector to share information that is really needed. But also we must develop redundancy in our key maritime infrastructure. This goes to us building resilience in our security strategies. One issue we don't really mention so much is research and innovation within the maritime community. we must be able to build our own capabilities. And the only way we can do that is to invest in research and innovation, to come up with solutions that are peculiar for our environment. Okay. I want to just go straight to the conclusion because of time. Just to recap the main points. Our maritime threats are evolving. There's a lot of unpredictability today within our waters. A lot of things are happening that we cannot necessarily foresee. And so the complexities are a lot. There's complexities with our stakeholders. There's complexities in our domain. And then the resulting security landscape that we get is full of so many complexities. So we need to have our MSS evolve with those complexities. As we are developing our strategies, we shouldn't keep them in stone. We need to adapt and implement, adapt and implement. So what we are saying is let's invest in adaptive systems. Let's ensure that we can be more resilient as a continent, basically, through proactive measures. And then let's foster cooperation, whether it's at the local level, whether it's at the regional level, whether it's at the international level. And then we need to support research and innovation so that we can build our own capabilities for Africa. So capabilities for Africa by Africans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. van Dijk. Once again, as always, very insightful. I want to, before I get to the next speaker, we will get to questions, but I think there's so much information coming through, and I would really urge you to engage with the relevant speakers when we have breaks during lunchtime. It would really, I think, it would benefit all of us. But if we can continue, I would like to call on Professor Lisa Otto. She will be talking about the nature of and utility of maritime diplomacy to Africa's littoral and island states. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege for me to be here today addressing you. We'll just wait for my presentation to come on the screen. There it is. So today I've been asked to talk to you about the nature and diplomacy, nature and utility of African states' maritime diplomacy. So I'm going to go through a few kind of framing remarks. It's not really for me to tell you that maritime issues are kind of moving from the periphery of the global agenda to the center. These are increasingly issues that are on the international agenda and are increasingly important issues that we find kind of coalescing at sea. Indeed, I think we also find that the sea is becoming an important strategic theater both for cooperation and conflict, and we see this emerging in various different ways in different parts of the world. And so as a result of this, maritime diplomacy is increasingly important as a tool for states in their diplomatic toolbox. Defense forces, and indeed including navies, have traditionally been used as an actor of diplomacy, as an actor carrying out the kind of outputs of that foreign policy. And while this has been viewed traditionally in a kind of narrow conceptualization, in viewing, I suppose, kind of in the context of peace and security, indeed there's a broader role, I think, for defense forces to play. And so when it comes to the maritime space specifically, and maritime diplomacy specifically, I talk about maritime diplomacy because it views the diplomacy in the ocean space as being broader than just naval diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy. And so we want to think also about the kind of positive and cooperative elements as opposed to just coercive kind of conflict-based responses. And so I borrow from South African colleagues who've defined maritime diplomacy as the behavior of a nation in pursuit of its maritime interests, usually by combining and applying the instruments of power. So there are three types of maritime diplomacy that I'd like to talk about today, and these are cooperative, persuasive, and coercive maritime diplomacy. And so what are these? Well, cooperative maritime diplomacy involves kind of collaborative efforts between states to address the challenges that we know are often cross-boundary, trans-boundary kind of issues that we need to address collectively. And so these issues are dealing with our mutual interests as states. And we see this coming in the form, for example, of joint naval exercises, joint efforts to address IUU fishing and piracy, as well as other issues. And this is a very effective tool for building trust between states, for fostering regional security, as well as for reducing the likelihood of conflict. Then we have persuasive maritime security, which is a little bit more subtle, and it uses naval forces and maritime activities to influence other states, and so this includes the use of soft power, or even to some degree, smart power. And this can involve diplomatic monologue and dialogue. And so by diplomatic monologue here, I think we can think of states, particularly Western Indian Ocean states, have been especially effective in this when it comes to how they've conceptualized maritime security threats, but also vis-a-vis their engagement around climate issues, which, as we know, are particularly pertinent at sea. It can also include dialogue between states, bilateral and multilateral fora, port visits, and other engagements through multilateral platforms. And so this is often used when cooperation is not immediately possible and when a state wants to persuade others and uses persuasive maritime diplomacy in a way that can result in some sort of forward momentum towards a goal. And so this is obviously also useful for enhancing its international standing, and to draw on the examples of the Western Indian Ocean island states again, I think they've kind of become known as these really loud voices on climate issues and on maritime issues because they've been able to kind of come together and employ this kind of smart diplomacy and a persuasive diplomacy around these issues that are really central to their national interest. This can also be utilized for attracting investment and for building alliances among states. And then lastly is coercive maritime diplomacy, and this is the use or threat of force, of naval force, to achieve a particular diplomatic objective, and it is intended to compel compliance or to deter some sort of aggressive behavior. And we can see examples of this coming in the form of blockades or maritime sanctions. And this is often used where diplomacy has failed or where a state wants to assert dominance and wants to achieve some sort of short-term goal. Of course, this also carries risk, which we will discuss a little bit later in this presentation. So what I'd like to do next is to look at different examples of where African states have employed these three different types of maritime diplomacy. So starting with cooperative maritime diplomacy, I think one of the key examples that is often cited around collaborative maritime security is the Gulf of Guinea, and the really good job that it has done in working cooperatively to address piracy, armed robbery at sea, petro-piracy, illegal fishing, and so on, these issues that have plagued that region for a long time. Of course, one of the key mechanisms that have been utilized in the Gulf of Guinea is the Yaoundé Code of Conduct of 2013, which has served as a protocol that's enabled states to coordinate maritime activities. They've introduced coordination centers. It's facilitated legal reform. This has, I think, also been a particularly important element by ensuring that there's a degree of kind of similarity across the the legal regimes in different countries, which allows for kind of integration in terms of the way that these crimes are being addressed. They've also partnered outside of the region with groups like the European Union in terms of addressing IUU fishing. And so there's been also a lot of kind of capacity building exercises, establishing joint monitoring, surveillance operations, and so on. And I think we've really seen this as a kind of positive engagement with overseas actors in order to address these challenges that have been facing the region. And then also when we look at a kind of more bilateral or even trilateral level, we've seen cooperation between these states in addressing these issues, and one example of that is a trilateral pact on IUU fishing that's been funded by the EU and entered into by Benin, Ghana, and Togo. A second example that I'd like to draw your attention to is the Indian Ocean, which I've already referenced a little. And here I'd like to highlight the Seychelles and the approach that Seychelles took during the height of Somali piracy and the ballooning effect that we saw of Somali piracy into the Indian Ocean. And we see Seychelles really having cooperated with regional and international partners here to address piracy and facilitating information sharing activities, coordinating joint naval operations, and indeed being really involved in that legal aspect in engaging in the establishment of regional courts and so on. It's also engaged with its neighbor, Mauritius, conducting joint patrols and surveillance to enforce fishing regulations and to protect natural resources in the maritime domain. And they've also cooperated with larger powers, and indeed we've seen this as part of India's strategy of moving into the Indian Ocean and having these engagements with countries like the Seychelles and like Mauritius in providing support in addressing these issues, which, given the islandness of these states and the fact that they might conceive of themselves as large ocean states, their national interest is very much tied to the maritime domain, and it can't be any other way. And for this reason, I think we've seen this very kind of prominent voice on their part on these issues in how they want this coordinated international effort to address the challenges that they face. So coming to persuasive maritime diplomacy, the first example I'd like to raise is of South Africa's naval diplomacy in Southern Africa. We know that, for example, one of the key examples has been the trilateral MOU that South Africa entered into with Tanzania and Mozambique under the auspices of SADC to engage in securing the Mozambique Channel. We've also had South Africa engaging consistently in IPSAMAR naval exercises, engaging consistently in IORA, and indeed also using its chairship between 2017 and 2019 to prioritize maritime safety and security, improve disaster risk management responses, and enhance fisheries management. And of course, it's also engaged in various symposia where it is able to persuade other states of its capacity in this realm. An interesting example here, I think, of persuasion is Djibouti, which has arisen as this hub for a variety of different naval bases. And we see it using its geostrategic location to cast itself as this kind of sustainable maritime hub. And has been, I suppose, an interesting revenue stream as well, in that it collects rent from these various countries that have their bases there. Figures of around $63 million per annum being paid by the US, 20 million by China, 30 million by France, and several other partners that are engaged there. And these missions obviously perform various roles, but it positions Djibouti itself as being able to benefit from the security by having the presence of these other countries there, and utilizing this to expand its own influence and project power. And so kind of in a way, not officially outsourcing its own protection, but having that kind of benefit as well. And then lastly, to come to coercive maritime diplomacy. Now, when I was looking for examples that I could offer, I think it's important to note that African states tend to engage in coercive maritime diplomacy a lot less often than the other two types that I've already highlighted, which I think is quite positive. Coercive maritime diplomacy comes with its risks, as I've said, and I'll cover that in the next two slides, but just to offer you a couple of examples quickly. So we've got Egypt's gunboat diplomacy in the Mediterranean, and this comes in the context of discoveries of gas and tensions with Turkey in the context of competing maritime claims. And so we've seen Egypt engaging in joint naval exercises with Greece and Cyprus, which have tried to send Turkey this message over its aggressive stance and saying, look, we've got the capability to push back, we're protecting our territory here. And then a historic example in the form of Gaddafi's line of death in the Gulf of Sidra, when Libya unilaterally claimed the Gulf of Sidra as part of its territory and warned against crossing what it called the line of death, and engaged in aggressive posturing to enforce this particular claim. And we saw this in the early 80s, leading to clashes with US forces that were conducting freedom of navigation operations. So then to just compare the use of these different maritime diplomatic strategies, firstly, around effectiveness and strategic impact, we see that cooperative maritime diplomacy is conducive to the creation of a stable maritime environment, assisting economic growth and investment while also leading to improved management of natural resources. Persuasive maritime diplomacy, for its part, is effective to showcase naval ability, to build long-term relationships between states, to promote peace and stability, and to serve also as a platform for asserting maritime interests and generating support for these maritime interests. Coercive maritime diplomacy can have benefit for the achievement of kind of immediate short-term tactical objectives, but its strategic impact is limited because of the risks that it carries. So coming to these risks and challenges, for cooperative maritime security, this obviously relies on very high levels of trust between states, the ability to coordinate and share information, and sometimes this can, of course, be difficult to achieve. But when you have that requisite level of commitment, I think we see really positive outcomes coming from this, although, as Dr. Van Dijk has already suggested, we need to be adaptive, and sometimes multilateral decision-making can be slow. Persuasion can be difficult for smaller or poorer states, given their lack of resources or perhaps lack of standing on the international stage, and so they have to utilize smart, targeted action. And then you need to utilize this with a kind of long-term goal, as this may be slow to yield results. And then coercive maritime diplomacy is inherently risky because it carries the potential for escalation by exacerbating underlying tensions that might be present. In terms of long-term implications, cooperation obviously can strengthen regional institutions capable of addressing a range of different challenges. Persuasion contributes to long-term stability and can enhance the soft power of states. And the reliance, obviously, on coercive measures can detract from cooperative efforts and can lead to cycles of conflict and instability. So what would I like the takeaway to be in terms of the policy that is formulated? Well, firstly, there's a need for a balanced approach, so the ability to integrate different types of diplomacy, different strategies, but really centering cooperation, because we see that has carries the most positive effects, but the ability also to utilize persuasion and coercion as necessary to address certain challenges. Then second is regional cooperation. So how can we strengthen existing cooperative frameworks and mechanisms in order to address maritime challenges, but also to collectively secure our maritime interests? Third is soft power. How can we invest in soft power initiatives to build influence and secure non-military benefits, especially economic benefits? And we know that this is the big kind of buzzword, is the blue economy. You know, so how do we really utilize these opportunities that exist at sea, and how do we utilize our soft power to ensure that we are accruing those benefits? And then around coercion, this should be obviously used quite sparingly and should be designed, when utilized, to avoid escalation and ensure synergy with broader diplomatic efforts around the particular issue. And then lastly, around the development goals, there's a need to integrate maritime diplomacy with development strategies, and this is to the point of kind of not operating in silos, ensuring that when we're thinking about our national interest, which is really what all our policy and other strategies should flow from, to what degree is our maritime policy kind of integrated in thinking about development goals. And this can come in the form of environmental protection, considerations around climate change, which in my view will become only increasingly important as the years pass, sustainable development more broadly, and economic growth objectives. So certainly in the South African context, we know that we face three key challenges. This is around inequality, poverty, and joblessness. And so when we're thinking about our maritime strategy, when we're thinking about how we engage maritime diplomacy, really we need to be thinking about those things. How does our maritime diplomacy serve our national interest? How do we integrate these things? And I'd like to leave it there. Thank you very much.
I think you'll all agree we've had very, very interesting discussions so far this morning. We are going to move now to the question and answer session, and I would like you to think about the questions that you would like to ask, but I'm going to just ask the captain to maybe just respond before we take the questions. Thank you.
Thanks for the officer's question. That's a good question. Actually, your question is mentioned in my speech because there are a lot of information in my speech, so it is hard to find the answer. So I summarize the question is that what is the target of build the maritime community with a shared future? I understand. I summarize the target as create 4 oceans and 5 jointly. It means what's the 4 oceans? That is the target of build a maritime community with a shared future is first create peaceful and secure ocean. Second, the prosperous ocean. The 3, open and inclusive ocean. And 4 is a clean and beautiful ocean. What is 5 jointly? The first is jointly safeguarding maritime peace and tranquility. The second is jointly address maritime security threats. The third, jointly promote maritime prosperity and development. The fourth, jointly advance the integration and maritime cultures. The last, jointly protect the marine environment. Over.
Thank you. Okay, so as I said, we have time for questions now, and I'd really like to thank my panel for keeping to your time. So we've left time for questions. I'll take the questions 3 at a time, and I would appreciate it if you could maybe just give us an indication if the question is directed to anyone specifically, or whether it is just a question for the panel to consider in general. So any questions?
Can I, excuse me, yes, can I elaborate to the last lecture from the professor?
Sure.
I have a questions. She mentioned that our brother in Egypt, they use a coercive strategy. I think for the exercise with Greek and other country. We from Saudi Arabia go to the area and do the exercise with them. And I think the coercive, the persuasive strategy is what our brother in Egypt do, because they are using a soft power and a peaceful approach for the issue. We know Egypt is a country always looking for the peaceful, and I think the coercive is away from what they are doing for the exercise. Can you elaborate why you using coercive strategy with I think the exercise is a best practice approach. They are using a software, and we go from the Red Sea and join them in the exercise.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, while I don't see any hands, so while you are maybe thinking about questions that you want to ask, Professor Otto.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay, this appears to be on. Thank you for your question. Yes, I mean, I think these things can be interpreted in different ways depending on what you lend emphasis to. So I think that coercive maritime diplomacy is not always the use of force, but sometimes the threat of force. And so it can certainly fit into both categories, right? Because while it is peaceful, and so it is that, in that sense also persuasive, but it's coercive in the sense that it's saying, we have might, we can use this might, and we will use this might. And so I think it's in that sense that it's coercive. Coercive is not necessarily always negative, but depending on the extent of the coercion or the extent of perhaps even the actual use of force, I think that's where it becomes a little riskier. And so indeed it's open to interpretation, and I certainly agree with your assessment as well.
Okay. Thank you. Any other? Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Brigadier Mohamed Shemote from Kenya. My concern is about the Somali piracy, and I'm directing this to the last presenter. When he mentions about Seychelles and Mauritius, I know Kenya is in that region, the Indian Ocean West Coast, and Kenya played a very big role in dealing with pirates in that region. And whichever way, diplomatic way, in the three areas she mentioned, but I only heard her talking about Seychelles and Mauritius. He didn't mention Kenya, and we are the ones who in fact fought the piracy in that region. We dealt with the piracy until we made sure that it came to an end. And we didn't see ships from Seychelles, we didn't see ships from Mauritius. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Can we take maybe another question, sir?
Yeah, I apologize, I will speak in French, please.
Sir?
That's okay? Yeah. Ma question...
Oh. Yeah.
It's okay?
So if you could just give us a moment, because which channel is the English is on one. Okay. You can go ahead, sir. Thank you.
Ma question s'adresse donc au docteur George du Ghana sur...
So, can language barriers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oui, je me suis intéressé à votre quasiment conclusion en disant que pour mieux mettre en place la stratégie maritime adaptée, vous suggérez qu'il y ait un processus où il y a comme deux mamelles, que la prise de décision soit décentralisée et qu'on centralise la coordination.
Sir, can I maybe ask you just to restart, because it apparently took just a little bit of time for the translation to kick in. So if you can, maybe just the first part of the question again, please. Apologies for that.
Oui. Votre suggestion de faire on mette en place, que le processus de décision soit décentralisé et que la coopération soit centralisée. Est-ce que dans un tel dispositif, il n'y a pas le risque qu'il y ait chaque fois affrontement entre les structures qui prennent la décision et celles qui doivent faire la coopération, disons opérationnelle peut-être, dans la mise en œuvre de la stratégie adaptée? Merci.
Okay. Are you ready to answer?
Thank you very much. Certainly, Kenya played a very important role, and my presentation was not intended to be exhaustive, but rather just to offer a few examples. So I chose Seychelles, but I'm also very aware of Kenya's role, and indeed, in the early part of my career, that was actually work that I did, looking at Kenya's role specifically in anti-piracy, but looking at the mechanisms of cutting off the kind of financial flows, which was a really, really interesting approach, looking at how those funds from Somali piracy were arriving in Nairobi, and how do you utilize that as a kind of non-military strategy to addressing that? And so certainly very interesting approaches that have come from Kenya as a key partner on the East African region in dealing with the Somali piracy problem.
Thank you. You ready? Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. You talked about a centralized coordination versus the application decentralized, using the local actors. Yes, I do get where the apprehension is from. Even though authority, you must provide, in my opinion, some authority to local actors to work. There are limits as to what they can actually do, but then they must have the capability to respond. If they want to wait always for HQ to say, do this and do that, yes, you will get a response, but in my opinion, the response will be very slow. And so there must be some authority at the local level to act, as it were, within the limits of the authority and respond to certain threats that they receive within their environment.
Okay. Thank you. We have time for another round of questions, sir. Yes?
Thank you very much. My specific questions or intervention is directly addressed to Dr. Van Dijk in your presentation on adaptive maritime strategy, in which you somehow alluded to the fact that long-term strategies are seemingly not working, looking at the evolving nature of threats within the past decades. And therefore, you seem to suggest that we should be focusing more on short-term strategies. I would like to put this question to you. Don't you think that rather than looking at our strategies being short-term, we should look at our strategies that are long-term, but at the same time dynamic in terms of adaptable to the changing environment, and also the possibility that within very short time frames, we can review those strategies and impute those changing dynamics into the strategy. But the overall objective of the strategy should remain long-term for us to be able to achieve the overall national interest, since strategy itself is designed to achieve national strategic objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Mine is general to the panel. I would like to hear their opinion on the best strategies for the region to engage with international naval partners operating in the region. Here, I mean the likes of Combined Maritime Forces, EU Operation Atalanta, and others. Because generally, most of the dialogue is bilateral, and in my opinion, you know, as a small naval power, you probably be a very junior partner in that kind of dialogue, and whether maybe what would be the best way to engage with them as a region. Thank you.
Thank you. We can take another question. Yes, sir?
Yes. Good afternoon, good morning to everybody. Captain Elia Cuoco from Italian Navy. So I have a question for my Chinese colleague, but it's open, of course, to all the panelists. We, as Navy, we maintain a deployment both in the Gulf of Guinea and in the Indian Ocean. So we have been able to experience both realities. In the Gulf of Guinea, it has been very effective, the cooperation with the deployers coming from Europe or from other continents, working together with coastal states. On the architecture, all the activities we have been able to conduct together have been really effective in tackling the piracy issues, etc. If I move on the other side of the continent and I specifically think about the Red Sea crisis, what we are living nowadays, I've seen a lot of different approaches. So CMF, Combined Maritime Forces, were just mentioned. They had a specific approach. The US, on the other side, they had another approach. I had the chance to be in the founding team of the UNAFOR Aspides, so the European Union mission created ad hoc for this crisis. And we used another approach that was purely defensive, for example. I would like to know the perception of my Chinese colleague, of course, on what would be the right approach, the right way to tackle the specific crisis that is affecting trades and security in Bab el-Mandeb area.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to allow my colleagues just to answer these questions, and then we'll take a final round. I acknowledge your hand, so we'll take, with the next round, we'll ask a question.
Thank you very much for your question. So you basically summarized my presentation from your question. It's not necessarily that that the strategies are too long. It's more about the review process or the reassessment process that is the problem. Because if we're going to wait for 3 to 5 years to look at the strategy that we've put together, things change dramatically in 3 to 5 years nowadays. If you look between 2019 and 2021, in 1 year we had COVID. Dramatic changes. If you look at what's happening in the Red Sea, it's changed the face of commercial shipping. So if we're going to stick to the review deadlines for our strategies, then things are not going to work. And that's why I talked about trigger points. Sometimes a trigger point will have to trigger a review of your strategy. So yes, I do agree with what you said. You can maintain the overall aim and vision of the strategy long term, but then you must look at the review process, the review time, and do some sort of reassessment, learn from what's going on, and then improve upon it.
Thank you. Professor Ote?
So on the question around strategies to engage with international forces, I think that this probably has to do, is probably also a resource question and a capacity question. The extent to which African countries are able to engage in those operations, I think, is an important one. But if we imagine that they are for a moment, I think that there's utility in engaging in these activities, exactly because it is going to advance a number of interests. It might be the specific issue that a particular combined force is addressing, but it might be broader as well around improving partnerships, building bilateral relationships, improving stature. So I think that there are a lot of different motivations that one might consider these kinds of engagements, but ultimately, and perhaps this is a separate question, but I think that to generalize African countries in general, and as a South African, I would say South Africa also in particular, we have to be realistic about the constraints that we face, and among those constraints are resource constraints. People in the South African defense space will know that it is a perennial complaint that the defense force has been kind of consistently underfunded over years, and many suggest that this is not something that is likely to change. And so I think when we look at the resource allocation, when we look at the capacity, when we look at our objectives and interests, we are probably better off taking a more strategic approach to limiting what we do, and then doing that very well, lining that up kind of more clearly with our national interest, and just being really clever about how we approach the resources that we do have and the objectives that we want to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Captain, do you want to respond?
Thanks to the Italian friend question. That question have a lot of information. And it mentioned some sensitive question. So I think I will exchange my opinion with him at lunchtime. Okay?
Okay, thank you. I think I'll take a final 2 questions, and then it's lunchtime, and then I would once again just say, you know what, engage please with our colleagues. So, sir, you've been waiting a while, and then if we can, this question, and if I can then ask just the rest to maybe during lunchtime ask your questions. Sir? Yeah.
Merci. Merci de m'en passer la parole. Moi, je suis le commandant de la force de la marine.
Okay, so if you can quickly give us a moment, who is the question directed at, so that we can just...
Je suis le général de brigade venant, Bivanimana. Je suis le commandant de la force de la marine burundaise.
Sir, who are you directing your question to?
Okay. Yeah. Vous avez parlé que les menaces de la sécurité maritime des pays ayant les lacs, les mers et les océans sont presque les mêmes choses. Alors, comment mener une stratégie commune dans des pays africains alors que les grandeurs des océans et mers ne sont pas les mêmes? Je vous remercie.
Okay, and then the final question, sir. And once again, I think we would probably, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Rear Admiral Yakubu from Ghana, and my question is directed to Professor Otto. We're all aware about the emerging great power competition, and it's playing out in the maritime domain. And Africa, as usual, is becoming a battleground for this great power competition. And how do we leverage on this kind of situation? It looks like Djibouti, from your presentation, has done well in managing competing interests from different great powers. But it's normally not an easy space to navigate. So what would be your recommendations to leverage on it so that African countries can benefit rather than be victims of it?
Okay, thank you. There was a final comment, very briefly, sir, from Senegal.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm a Rear Admiral Abdustain, Chief of Naval Staff of the Senegalese Navy. First of all, I want to thank you all for the great presentation. I really enjoy each presentation. And I like the concept of adaptive maritime security strategy, which is a concept that changed our way of doing business. But my question is more related to maritime diplomacy. Ma'am, do you think that maritime diplomacy can be counterproductive for African navies in the way of building their capacities when it's about multi-partners engagement? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Otto, it seems like you have a number of questions to briefly answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
So if I can start by, I assume that your question was for me, but I didn't catch it because we don't have enough headsets up here. So if possible, could I answer the other two gentlemen's questions and then ask you to repeat the question? I'll put my headset on. Is that okay? Okay. So around great power competition with Africa as a battleground, how do we leverage this? I think that Djibouti has done a good job, but I think it's based on the assessment of its realities. And so I think that this is really where, because it's difficult, I think, to generalize an answer to the whole continent of Africa. I think there's a tendency sometimes to think of Africa as a monolith, and of course it is not. Each country has its very own interests and dynamics and geopolitical considerations and so on. And so I think this actually for me is where it starts, is having a very sober kind of national conversation, national dialogue about these realities for each particular country. Vis-a-vis resources and capacity. But I think one thing for me that's very central, so an area that I'm working on at the moment is the Indo-Pacific, which is perhaps the battleground for great power contestation in the next decade, right? And I'm not aware of a single African country that has an Indo-Pacific strategy. And so it's very difficult then, when you look at the loads of different conceptualizations of the Indo-Pacific. Some of those conceptualizations include the eastern littoral of Africa and the western Indian Island Ocean states. Some do not. But it's very difficult to imagine what the role of Africa is in this domain, in the context of great power contestation, when Africa itself has not thought about it. Indeed, we've had conversations with Global North partners who say, we're looking for partners in Africa, but we don't know where to go because we don't know where they stand on this issue of the Indo-Pacific. What is their strategic interest in this region? And so that's just an example. But my point is that I think when countries can have really a sober conversation about their interests measured against their resources, the constraints, and then take a very kind of smart approach to saying, we can't do all things, we can't be all things to all partners. Where do we prioritize? How can we leverage this situation? I think you can find other examples, again in the Western Indian Island Ocean states, because I think they've been playing this kind of China-India game in quite an interesting way, how they've kind of, I don't want to say played the countries off against each other because I don't think it's that necessarily, but how they've leveraged the respective geostrategic interests in these places in order to advance their national interests. And so I think it's individualized. I apologize, I don't mean to be provocative. So take from that what you will. Can maritime diplomacy be counterproductive? I think it depends on how how the defense forces view themselves as an actor within the diplomatic space. I think that, you know, we're in this and we often tell our students that we moved away from the nature of war having been largely intrastate to it being interstate, right? So this is the nature of conflict in contemporary times, where we see the majority of conflict not being between states, but within states. Indeed, of course, there are these two significant, complicated conflicts between states. So I'm not discounting that, but I think the point is that you know, how do the defense forces conceptualize of themselves? What is their relationship to foreign affairs within a country, and what is the kind of integration there? What is that conversation there? Because ultimately, different departments, different agencies should all really be singing from the same hymn sheet, because they're serving the same national interests. They're doing that just in their particular, you know, corner of the playing field, as it were. And so I think that perhaps maritime diplomacy can be counterproductive if the actors are not engaging with a kind of broader mindset, when they're engaging with a more singular mindset. So I suppose this is back to that kind of truism of the all-of-government approach, right? And everybody kind of working together, not in silos.
Okay. Thank you. If maybe we can address just finally that question, if you can maybe just repeat that, sir, and then we can quickly just draw this to a conclusion, because we're now into lunchtime. So.
Ma question concerne ma question concerne les menaces pour la sécurité maritime où les pays ayant des océans et les mers et les lacs ont les mêmes menaces. Je voudrais savoir pourquoi mettre une stratégie commune alors que les étendues des océans et mers et lacs ne sont pas les mêmes. J'ai une approche d'une réponse. Chaque pays ou chaque grande puissance ont la façon de faire de ces stratégies selon les moyens de son ressort, de son pays. Une stratégie commune ne peut pas quand même exister. Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So the gentleman raises an important question, I think, also around lakes and rivers, countries that are perhaps landlocked or may have lakes and rivers as borders. And he raises this in the context of having a common strategy, common maritime strategy. So I assume here referring to the AU strategy. And I think, yes, that there are these kind of complexities in the difference of maritime domain, but it's actually quite interesting when you do an exercise to overlay things that you might consider to be traditional maritime security threats or concerns in a lacustrine environment. You actually find that there's a lot of overlap. Indeed, I believe the African, the AU definition of the maritime domain includes lakes and rivers, which is a unique approach, because I don't think that this is true elsewhere in the world. And so, yes, I think we need, as Dr. Van Dijk has been saying, we need flexibility. We need the ability to understand, as I said previously, that Africa is not a monolith, and that we, you know, that each country's environment and considerations are going to be individual, that are going to be particular. But at the same time, I think we also have common interests that we can each be, as countries, a cog in broader mechanism trying to address these challenges, but also opportunities in the maritime domain. And I think it's about asserting the individuality within the broader framework. Of course, the protection of sea lines of communication also remain an important issue for landlocked countries. exactly, because they also depend on trade. They also need to get their goods to the sea. They also need to receive goods from the sea. So I think that there's an opportunity to find synergy, but that doesn't necessarily take away from asserting individuality also within the broader context at the AU level. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We've already run over time. My apologies for that. We will, I'm just handing over to the program director. So thank you once again for your time. And I want to really thank my panel. I think it was really amazing presentations. Thank you.
Yes, you can carry on. Indeed, let's give another round of applause to our speakers. Some key takeaways, and I'm just going to highlight about 3 of them. Senior Colonel Shin Chen highlighted the acronym of SHIP. I think that is refreshing. With regards to Colonel Van Dijk, a key takeaway from his speech, he highlighted where a country's economy is largely dependent on maritime trade. The maritime threats increase exponentially. That's very interesting. He also touched on decentralized decision-making with centralized command. And for us military people, that's mission command, where we take decisions on the spot based on the rules of engagement within the context. With regards to Professor Otto, the 3 types of maritime diplomacy, i.e. cooperative, persuasive, and coercive, is interesting key points from the South African Navy, India, and Brazil's point of view. That maritime diplomacy is currently at work with regards to exercise IPSAMA that's currently underway on the western coast of South Africa and is scheduled to run until almost the end of the Seapower for Africa Symposium. So thank you very much to the speakers for very educational and refreshing presentations. Let me not repeat their presentations and move on to the next activity for the day, which is our lunch break. Once again, lunch will be served in Hall 6. Some of the senior members can join Chief of the Navy in the Pincushion room.